Hey, welcome back to the channel. Today's stories all have something in common, and it's something I think is scarier than any clear monster or any obvious threat. In every one of these, someone working alone at night saw something, a shape, a figure, something that was definitely there, definitely real in some sense, but never close enough or clear enough to actually identify. No face, no real form you could describe to a police sketch artist, just a shape that shouldn't have been there, doing things that didn't make sense. If you've ever worked nights and seen something you couldn't explain, I want it in the comments. New here? Subscribe. We do this every week. Let's get into it.
I worked nights at a distribution warehouse for almost 2 years. The kind of place where trucks come in at all hours and stuff gets sorted and loaded onto other trucks going back out before morning. Big building, mostly open floor space, with a row of loading dock doors along one side that stay open or half open depending on what's actively being worked. My job specifically was overnight inventory, which meant that I was usually away from the loading area itself, walking the shelving aisles with a handheld scanner, checking stock levels, that kind of thing. Pretty solitary work, even on a night when other people were also on shift, because everyone's spread out doing their own section. This happened on a night in March, cold enough that the loading dock doors being open meant the whole back third of the warehouse stayed pretty chilly, even with the heaters they had running. I remember that detail specifically because of what happened later, the cold actually mattering to the story in a way I didn't expect at the time. I was maybe 4 hours into my shift, working an aisle close to the back of the warehouse, not far from the loading dock area, when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I want to be clear about what I mean by that, because it's the part I've struggled to explain to people since. It wasn't like seeing a person walk past. It was more like noticing that the quality of the light had changed somewhere near dock door 4, a kind of shifting darkness, like something large had moved through the gap between the door and the trailer backed up to it. I stopped what I was doing and looked directly at it. There was nothing there, just the open dock door, the back of a parked trailer, the usual stuff. I figured it was probably one of the loading crew, somebody walking past at an angle that caught my eye weird, and went back to scanning. About 20 minutes later, I was a couple aisles over, and I saw it again, this time more clearly, or at least clearer in the sense that I could tell it wasn't nothing, even if I still couldn't tell what it actually was. A shape, tall, moving along the far wall near the dock doors, low light back there because that section's overhead lighting had been flickering for weeks. Maintenance kept saying they'd get to it. The shape moved with a kind of fluid quickness that didn't match a normal walking pace, more like it had crossed the 30-foot stretch of wall in maybe 2 seconds, which I know doesn't sound like much written out like that, but standing there watching it happen, my whole body just went cold. I didn't call out. I didn't really know what I would even say. I just stood there, scanner still in my hand, watching that section of wall where I'd lost sight of it, waiting for something to happen or for someone to come around the corner and explain it as completely normal, a trick of the bad lighting back there, nothing more. Nobody came around the corner. I went back to work because that's honestly what you do. You tell yourself you imagined it, and you keep your job moving, because stopping to investigate every weird shadow in a giant warehouse at 2 a.m. isn't really practical or sane behavior, even if some part of you wants to. Maybe 40 minutes after that, I was crouched down checking a low shelf, scanner beeping its normal confirmation sounds, when I heard something that made every hair on my arms stand up at once. A sound from the aisle behind me. Not footsteps, exactly. More like something dragging slightly against the concrete floor. Slow, deliberate. The kind of sound that made me think of something moving without quite lifting its feet all the way off the ground. I turned around fast.
The aisle behind me was empty, stretching back toward the main floor, nothing visible in either direction. But the sound had stopped the instant I turned around, which somehow felt worse than if it had kept going, because it meant whatever made it had reacted to me turning around. It had been paying attention.
I stood up slowly, scanner still in hand, and started walking back toward the main part of the warehouse where other people were actively working. Not running exactly, but moving with purpose, the way you walk when you're trying to convince yourself you're not scared while every part of you actually is. I found one of the loading crew guys, a coworker I'll call Tony, doing his usual thing near the trucks, and I asked him, trying to keep my voice casual, if anyone else had been back in the aisles near Dock 4 in the last hour. He said no, he hadn't seen anyone go back there besides me, and the rest of the loading team had all been right there with him the whole time, visible to each other the entire shift like usual. I told him I thought I'd seen something, kept it vague, didn't want to sound like I was losing it. He didn't laugh it off the way I expected. Instead, he got kind of quiet and asked me to describe what I saw. When I described the shape, the way it moved, the height of it, he nodded slowly and said something that stuck with me ever since. He said a couple other people on different shifts had mentioned something similar over the past few months, always near that same section of the warehouse, always described roughly the same way, always too far or too dark to make out any actual features. He said management knew about it, sort of, in the sense that enough people had brought it up that it had become a known thing among the night crew, but nobody had ever gotten close enough or had a clear enough look to report anything specific to actually act on. It was just something people had started avoiding, that back corner near Dock 4, without ever really talking about why out loud. I finished my shift that night sticking close to other people as much as my job allowed, which wasn't entirely possible, given that inventory work requires being alone in aisles by nature. I didn't see the shape again that night, but I started noticing things differently after that, paying attention in a way I hadn't before. And over the following weeks, I caught glimpses maybe 3 or 4 more times, always at the edge of my vision, always near that same general area, never once clear enough to actually describe with any real confidence. I started keeping a mental log of when it happened, trying to find some kind of pattern, day of the week, time of night, even the weather outside, though I'll admit that last one was probably reaching for connections that weren't really there. What I did notice was that it always seemed to happen during the quieter stretches of the shift, never when there was a lot of activity at the loading docks, never when multiple trucks were being worked at once. It was like it preferred the lulls, the moments when the warehouse itself went unusually still. I also noticed something else that I've never been able to fully explain. On the nights when I caught a glimpse of it, my scanner would sometimes glitch right around the same time, throwing an error code I'd never seen before or after, something the IT guy who eventually looked into it couldn't replicate or explain when I brought it up weeks later.
He just shrugged and said sometimes the older handheld units did weird things, especially in the colder sections of the warehouse, where the battery contacts could get finicky. I wanted to believe that was all it was. Some part of me still isn't sure. The closest I ever got to anything definite happened about 2 months after that first night. I was walking past Dock 4 itself, the actual door, not the aisles near it, late in my shift, maybe 5 in the morning, with that exhausted clarity you get near the end of an overnight, when I felt, rather than saw, something pass close behind me. Not touching me, but close enough that I felt a shift in the air, a kind of pressure change, the way you'd feel if someone walked quickly past you in a narrow space without actually making contact. I spun around immediately. Nothing there. The dock door was open to the night outside, cold air coming in same as always, the parking lot beyond it empty and quiet under the security lights. I stood there for a long moment, just breathing, trying to convince myself it was a draft, temperature difference from the open door, anything with a normal explanation. A few weeks after that, curiosity got the better of me, and I actually asked around the warehouse a little more broadly, not just with Tony, but with a couple of the longer tenured employees on the day shift during a brief overlap one morning. One older guy who'd worked there for almost a decade told me something that I still think about. He said the warehouse had been built on a piece of land that used to be part of a much older industrial site, something from way back before the current building existed at all, and that there'd always been a vague rumor among longtime staff about something happening on that property a long time ago, though nobody seemed to know any actual specifics, just that the rumor existed, and had apparently existed for as long as anyone could remember working there. He said it the way you'd mention any old workplace superstition, half serious and half like he was just passing along folklore, because that's what you do when someone asks. But there was something in how quickly he answered, like he'd been asked some version of this question before and already had his explanation ready. I worked there for another 8 months after that and never got any clearer answer than what I had that first night. The shape, whatever it was, never seemed to do anything beyond exist at the edges of where I could see it, moving in ways that didn't quite match anything I could compare it to. Never approaching directly, never making any sound except that one dragging noise that one time. I eventually left that job for reasons unrelated to any of this, better pay elsewhere, and I haven't worked another overnight warehouse job since. I think about Dock 4 sometimes when I can't sleep, trying to picture what I actually saw in enough detail to describe it properly, and I still can't. It's just a shape, a wrongness in the dark that I never got close enough to understand.
I worked as an overnight resident assistant in a college dormitory for a year, which basically meant I lived in the building and was on call for anything that came up overnight, in addition to doing regular walkthroughs of the halls to make sure everything was secure and nothing was going on that shouldn't be. The building itself was older than most of the other dorms on campus, built sometime in the 60s from what I understood, with this one weird architectural feature that always struck me as strange even before anything happened. There was a back stairwell on the north end of the building that wasn't part of the main traffic flow, mostly used for emergency exit purposes since the elevator and main stairs were both on the south side near the lobby. Almost nobody used that back stairwell regularly, which meant it stayed quiet and a little neglected in a way the rest of the building didn't. Part of my overnight routine involved checking that stairwell, along with everything else, just to make sure the emergency exit doors were secure and nobody was using the space for anything they shouldn't be. Most nights it was completely uneventful, just a quiet, empty stairwell that smelled faintly of old paint and concrete, the kind of space that every old building has and that nobody thinks about until they have to. This happened in November, a few months into the school year, on a Wednesday night that started out completely normal. I'd done my first round of checks around midnight, everything fine, back stairwell included, nothing unusual. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting at the front desk doing some homework, trying to use the quiet overnight hours productively, the way you do when you're a broke college student working this kind of job, and I heard something that made me look up. A sound from somewhere deep in the building, distant enough that I couldn't immediately place it, but distinct, almost rhythmic, like something being dragged slowly across a hard floor somewhere. I sat there for a second, trying to figure out if I should investigate or if it was just normal building noise, old pipes or something settling, the kind of thing every building does at night that you learn to tune out after a while. The sound stopped on its own before I decided anything, and I went back to my homework, telling myself it was nothing. About 20 minutes later, I went to do an unscheduled check, mostly because the sound had bothered me more than I wanted to admit, and I figured walking the halls would either confirm there was nothing wrong or at least make me feel better for having checked. I walked the main hallways first, everything normal, a few lights on under doors where students were clearly still up studying, or whatever college students do at 2 a.m., nothing concerning. I made my way toward the back stairwell last, since it was the farthest point from the desk and usually the least eventful part of my rounds. I opened the stairwell door and the motion sensor light flickered on, that harsh fluorescent buzz it always made when it first kicked in. The stairwell looked normal, empty, just the usual gray concrete steps zigzagging up through the building. I started my walk up, checking each landing the way I always did. On the third floor landing, I stopped. There was something at the top of the next flight, right where the stairs turned toward the fourth floor. I genuinely could not tell what I was looking at. It wasn't a person standing normally. The shape was wrong somehow, too elongated in a way that made my brain struggle to process it as anything specific. It was dark, darker than the surrounding shadows, even with the fluorescent light technically reaching that area, like it was somehow absorbing the light around it instead of being lit by it. I froze on that landing, staring up at it. It wasn't moving as far as I could tell, just present there, occupying that space at the top of the stairs in a way that felt completely wrong. I remember my brain trying desperately to categorize it as something normal, a trick of shadow, a coat someone left hanging, anything, and failing every single time because none of those explanations actually fit what I was looking at. I said something, I don't even remember exactly what, some kind of hey or hello, the instinctive thing you say when you think you might be looking at a person. The shape didn't respond verbally, but it shifted, just slightly, a kind of subtle motion that somehow conveyed awareness without actually moving its position, like it had heard me and was acknowledging it without doing anything as normal as turning toward me. That's when I noticed the temperature. I know that sounds like something out of a movie, but it was real, a genuine drop in temperature on that landing that I could feel immediately, like stepping into a walk-in freezer for a second, sharp and sudden, in a way that didn't match any explanation involving drafts or open windows, especially not on an interior stairwell 3 floors up.
I backed away from that landing fast. Back down the stairs I just climbed, not running exactly, but moving with a speed that definitely wasn't casual. I got back to the 2nd floor landing and looked back up. I couldn't see the shape anymore from that angle, the stairwell's zigzag design blocking the sightline, and for a second I genuinely couldn't decide if that was better or worse than being able to see it. I made it back down to the lobby level and didn't go back into that stairwell for the rest of the shift. I sat at the desk for the remainder of the night with every light on that I could control, trying to focus on homework, but mostly just listening for any sound from that direction of the building. The next day, I mentioned what happened to another RA, a guy named Jamal who'd worked in that building for 2 years already, way longer than my 1 semester there at that point. I expected him to either laugh it off or look at me like I was being dramatic. Instead, his face did something I wasn't expecting, a kind of recognition, like I'd just described something he already knew about. He told me that stairwell had a reputation among RAs going back years, that he'd personally seen something similar himself during his first year working there, and that at least 2 other people he knew had described almost identical experiences, always on that same back stairwell, always around the 3rd or 4th floor landing area, always describing the same wrong, elongated shape and the same sudden cold. He said nobody had ever reported it officially because there wasn't really anything concrete to report. No actual incident, no theft, no damage, just a feeling and a shape that nobody could properly describe. The university wasn't going to investigate something that vague, so it had just become this quiet, half-acknowledged thing among the RA staff, passed down informally from year to year without ever becoming anything official. I worked the rest of that year doing my checks of that stairwell, but I always did them faster after that, never lingering on any landing longer than necessary, always keeping my eyes moving rather than fixing on any one shadow for too long. I saw something there one more time before the year ended, just a brief glimpse on a different landing, gone again almost as soon as I registered it, and that was enough for me to request a different building assignment for my 2nd year, citing personal preference rather than the actual reason, because I genuinely didn't think anyone in the housing office would take the real explanation seriously. That 2nd glimpse happened in February, and it's worth describing because it was different in one specific way that's bothered me ever since. It wasn't on the same landing as the first time. It was 1 floor lower, on the 2nd floor landing instead of the 3rd, almost like it had moved closer to the main part of the building over the months between sightings, closer to where people actually lived and walked through regularly. I don't know if that means anything. I've turned that thought over so many times since then, whether it was just coincidence,
different landings just happening to be where I caught glimpses at different times, or whether there was something more deliberate happening, some kind of slow encroachment I was lucky enough to leave before it concluded in whatever way it might have been building toward. I talked to Jamal again before the year ended, told him about the second sighting, and he got quiet in a way that made me think he was holding something back. When I pushed him on it, he admitted that the story he'd originally told me had left out one detail, something he said he hadn't wanted to scare me with when I was still new to the job. He said one of the RAs from a few years before either of us, someone he'd only heard about secondhand from older staff, had reportedly had some kind of more serious encounter with whatever was in that stairwell, serious enough that the person had quit the job entirely partway through the semester, and the university had quietly reassigned a different student rather than draw attention to why the position had opened mid-year. Jamal said he didn't know any more specifics than that, just that the story existed among the more long-time staff, passed down the way these things get passed down, vague enough by the time it reaches you that you can't really verify any of it, but consistent enough in its basic shape that it felt like it had to be rooted in something real. I still don't know what that shape was. I've thought about it constantly in the years since, tried to find some rational explanation that fits everything I experienced, the wrongness of the shape itself, the way it seemed to register my presence without behaving like a person would, the sudden cold that came with it. I've never landed on anything that actually explains all of it together. I just know what I saw, and what Jamal saw, and what at least 2 other people apparently saw before either of us ever worked there. I worked overnight security for a hospital parking structure for about a year and a half. A job that mostly involved sitting in a small booth near the entrance and doing periodic walkthroughs through the structure itself, checking that everything was secure, occasionally helping someone who'd locked their keys in their car or needed a jump start, that kind of thing. The structure was 5 levels, mostly used by hospital staff working overnight shifts themselves, plus occasional visitors there for emergency room visits at odd hours. Never fully empty, but definitely quiet during the deep overnight hours. Maybe a dozen or fewer cars scattered across the upper levels at any given time between about 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. This happened on a night in late summer, humid enough that even the concrete structure felt warm and close in a way it usually didn't. I was doing my scheduled walkthrough, starting from the top level and working my way down, which was my usual pattern, when I noticed something on level 4 that immediately felt wrong. There was a figure standing near the far end of the level, away from where any cars were actually parked, just standing in an open stretch of empty parking spaces under one of the structure's overhead lights. I want to be specific about what made it feel wrong immediately, beyond just the location being strange for someone to be standing. The lighting in that area was decent, bright enough that I should have been able to make out basic details, clothing, approximate age, something. I couldn't make out any of that. The figure was just a shape, humanoid in the most basic sense, upright, roughly the right proportions, but somehow resistant to actually resolving into anything more specific no matter how I looked at it. I called out, the standard thing you're trained to say, asking if they needed help finding their vehicle or if everything was okay. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, just remained standing there in that same spot. I started walking toward it, partly out of professional obligation, since approaching unclear situations was literally my job, and partly because some instinct in me wanted to resolve the wrongness of what I was looking at into something normal, a confused visitor. An exhausted nurse who'd stepped outside for air and was just standing there in a daze. As I got closer, maybe 40 feet away, the figure turned. Not dramatically, just a simple rotation like it was acknowledging my approach, but something about the motion itself was off, too smooth somehow, lacking the small natural irregularities a real person's movement always has. I stopped walking. Every instinct I had was telling me something was deeply wrong, even though I genuinely could not point to any single specific detail that confirmed it, beyond the general wrongness of the whole situation. I tried calling out again, my voice probably betraying more nervousness than I wanted it to. No response. The figure just stood there, facing me now, and for a long, stretched-out moment, neither of us moved. Then it started walking toward me. I want to be honest about what happened in my body in that moment because I think it matters for understanding the rest of the story. Every part of me wanted to run immediately without thinking. But some other part, maybe just professional habit, maybe just disbelief, kept me rooted there for a few crucial seconds longer than I should have stayed. The figure's walk was wrong in a way I still struggle to articulate. Not limping, not stumbling, just wrong in its rhythm, like watching someone walk in a video that's been very subtly altered in its frame rate. Technically smooth, but somehow not matching how a body should actually move through space. That's when I finally moved, backing away fast, then turning and walking quickly back toward the stairwell I'd come up from, glancing back once to check the distance between us. The figure was still coming, same pace, not rushing to catch up, but also not falling behind, maintaining whatever distance had existed when I started moving. I got into the stairwell and went down fast, 2 levels at places, and got back to my booth near the entrance where there was at least some lighting and the general sense of being closer to an exit if things got worse. I called my supervisor, tried to explain what I'd seen, knowing even as I said it how it was going to sound. He was understandably skeptical at first, asked if I maybe seen someone who was just confused or under the influence, which is honestly the most common explanation for unusual behavior in a hospital parking structure at night. People in all kinds of mental and physical states ending up there for all kinds of reasons. I told him what I'd seen didn't match that. The way it moved, the way it just stood there for so long before reacting to me at all. But I could hear in his voice he wasn't fully buying it. Not in a dismissive way, just in the way anyone would react to a story that doesn't have a normal explanation. He sent another guard up to do a walkthrough with me about 20 minutes later, once I'd calmed down enough to function normally again. We went back up through every level together, methodically, checking every parking space, every stairwell, every corner. We found nothing. No figure, no sign that anyone unusual had been there, nothing on the small handful of working security cameras that covered parts of the structure, though I'll note that Level 4 specifically had a known blind spot in its camera coverage that maintenance had been meaning to fix for months, something I only learned about that night when my supervisor mentioned it almost as an afterthought. I finished my shift that night, sticking close to the booth and the lower levels as much as my job allowed, and I didn't see the figure again before my shift ended at 6 a.m. I worked there for another 5 months after that night. I never saw the figure again with that same clarity, but there were a handful of other nights where I'd catch something at the edge of my vision on the upper levels, a shape that resolved into nothing when I looked directly at it, and each time it happened, my whole body would go cold with the memory of that one specific night. I eventually requested a transfer to a different facility within the same security company, citing scheduling reasons rather than the actual truth, because I genuinely didn't think anyone would take the real explanation seriously. And honestly, I'm not sure I'd have blamed them if they didn't. I still don't know what I saw that night. I've gone back and forth more times than I can count, between thinking it was some kind of exhaustion-related hallucination, the result of too many overnight shifts messing with my perception, and thinking it was something else entirely that I have no proper framework for understanding. Before I transferred, I made one more attempt to find an explanation, mostly for my own peace of mind. I asked one of the hospital's overnight nursing supervisors, someone who'd worked there for almost 20 years and who I'd built a friendly rapport with over my months on that job, if she'd ever heard anything strange associated with that parking structure. She got a careful look on her face, the kind people get when they're deciding how much to actually say,
and eventually told me that there had been, years before my time there, an incident in that structure involving a patient who'd wandered away from one of the hospital floors during some kind of medical episode, and was later found on one of the upper levels, having apparently been there for some time before anyone located them. She was vague about the exact outcome, whether the person survived or not, and I didn't push for more detail, because something in how carefully she chose her words told me this wasn't a story she felt entirely comfortable elaborating on. I don't know if that incident has anything to do with what I saw. I don't know if anything does. What I know for certain is that it walked toward me. That part I'm sure of, more sure of almost anything else from that whole period of my life. Something stood in an empty parking structure at 3 in the morning, registered that I was there, and made a deliberate choice to start moving in my direction. I've never needed any further confirmation beyond that to know I made the right call running when I did. I think about that night more than I'd like to admit, even now, years later, in a completely different job with completely different hours. Sometimes walking through a parking garage during the day, somewhere totally unrelated, somewhere with plenty of light and plenty of people around, I'll catch myself glancing toward empty corners anyway, some leftover instinct from that one summer that I don't think will ever fully go away.
3 night shifts, 3 completely different locations, and in every single one, the same unsettling pattern. Something there. Something real enough to see, real enough to feel, real enough to provoke genuine fear in people whose jobs require them to stay calm in unusual situations, but never close enough, never clear enough for anyone to actually say what it was. I think that's almost scarier than a clear monster would be. At least with a clear threat, you know what you're dealing with. These people didn't get that. They just got a shape, a wrongness, something that existed at the very edge of what they could perceive and never came into focus. If you've worked nights and seen something like this, something you still can't put into words properly, I want to hear about it in the comments below. There's something specific about not being able to describe what you saw that makes these stories different from a lot of the others we cover on this channel. Usually there's at least some detail to hold on to. A face, an item of clothing, something concrete. In all 3 of tonight's stories, that detail never came. Just a shape, a wrongness, something that registered as deeply, undeniably present without ever resolving into something nameable. I think that's part of why these stick with people the way they do. Your brain wants to file things into categories, person or animal or shadow or nothing at all. And when something refuses to fit cleanly into any of those boxes, it just sits there, unresolved, the way these stories have sat unresolved with the people who lived through them for years afterward. Stay safe out there, especially if you're the one working while the rest of the world sleeps, and I'll see you in the next one.